what happened, particularly after World War II, and this was in this, era where people kind of were rightfully saying, never again, obviously about the Holocaust, more broadly about World War II, we can never go back to that kind of conflict. And you have the United Nations, you have
of course,
all of these sorts of, right, like that is everybody's focus. And that is when the arguments about free trade actually start to emerge. And they emerge not actually primarily as economic arguments. They emerge as a sort of new model of a global world order. And, one thing people looked at,
now you're getting to the heart of it.
Well, one thing, so people look at, what happened after World War I, the way Germany had been treated, the idea that, sort of holding them down rather than supporting them helps lead to World War II. So how are we going to rebuild the world after World War II? How are we going to build a sort of inclusive market that builds these companies up? How are we going to rebuild Japan as a democracy? How are we going to rebuild Germany as a democracy? How are we going to combat the Soviet Union, which, remember, is out there now putting out this ideology that says markets just can't work at all? We are going to put forward this vision. And the best illustration of this is guy Paul Samuelson, Nobel Prize winner, sort of writes the Standard Economics textbook that comes out in 1948, right after World War II. Remember, I mentioned the invisible hand gets ellipsed. That's in this textbook. And
which was the textbook for generations.
The textbook, exactly. And I have a copy now. I went and got you go through it and you say, okay, well, how does he make the argument about free trade? And what you find is that he really doesn't. He actually acknowledges all the ways that free trade might not work, that it might be bad for the United States, especially if other countries behave a certain way. And he says, quite bluntly, basically, so what? That if we actually want to build this kind of global economy that we all agree we need, the United States basically just needs to take the lead and push this forward. And
wow.
And look, again, and maybe I'm being too charitable again, but I can see why someone would say that in 1948.
I totally agree. And I got to college 40 years after that book was written, and it was the first book you read in economics class.
Yeah. And by the way, you could even say it was right in 1948. That and this goes to the point about the boomers, that the policy as we pursued it into the 50s and 60s did accomplish a lot of what we wanted it to. There's a very famous article in Foreign Affairs in 1971 where one of the kind of leaders of international economic thinking says quite explicitly, he says, the case for free trade has always been primarily a foreign policy case, not an economic policy case. And then, of course, you get to that when we get to China, right? The entire argument for welcoming China into WTO. I mean, economists said this will create good jobs for Americans and whatever. But the actual argument was, this is going to fix China. This is the way we democratize China, we liberalize China. And if that happens, if China does become a liberal democracy and we do bring them forward in this way, then won't it be wonderful that we have trade with them, and won't it be great that everybody prospers? And again, that wasn't if that had happened, that might have been a good idea too. The problem is that in the post-Cold War era, this model fell apart very quickly.
Wait, can I say, why have I never heard this before? I mean, it's the most interesting thing I've heard in a long time. So you're saying that our economic model was not primarily an economic model, was an instrument of foreign policy. It was like the centerpiece of the global order, post-war global order. And it wasn't designed really to help the United States as much as it was to preserve stability around the world. Is that what you're saying?
There are other people who say that. I've written an essay about it. It's called the free trade origin myth, that kind of goes through the chapter and verse on all these various things.
The way it was presented to me as someone who was always conservative and for markets and repeated all the slogans and all that, and was living in the world where I didn't know a single person who disagreed, talk about a bubble, was that free market economics, in the way that the United States was doing it, was not really an instrument, wasn't even a theory, it was like a physics principle.
Right.
It's just true. Okay. So, and to the extent that you deviate from it, you get punished. To the extent that you hew to it, you're rewarded, because like gravity, it's just real.
Right. And this is the fundamentalism.
But I had no idea that this was like the UN, something that people who are understandably like horrified by what they'd just gone through, the World War.
Yeah.
It was part of their reaction to that. And they're like, this will prevent that from happening again. It's one of the saddest things about this country. The country's getting sicker. Despite all of our wealth and technology, Americans aren't doing well overall. Obesity, heart disease, autoimmune conditions, all kinds of horrible chronic illnesses, weird cancers are all on the rise. Probably a lot of reasons for this, but one of them definitely is Americans don't eat very well anymore. They don't eat real food. Instead, they eat industrial substitutes, and it's not good. It's time for something new, and that's where masa chips come in. Masa has decided to revive real food by creating snacks how they used to be made, how they're supposed to be made. A masa chip has just 3 simple ingredients, not 117. 3. No seed oils, no artificial additives, just real delicious food. And I know this because we eat a ton of them in my house. And by the way, I feel great. So you can still continue to snack, but you can do it in a healthy way with chips without feeling guilty about it. Masa chips are delicious. They taste how a tortilla chip is supposed to taste. But the thing is, you can hit them really, really hard, and I have, and not feel bloated or sluggish after. You feel like you've done something decent for your body. You don't feel like you got a head injury, or you don't feel filled with guilt. You feel light and energetic. It's the kind of snack your grandparents ate. Worth bringing back. So you can go to masachips.com. Masa is M-A-S-A, by the way. masachips.com/Tucker to start snacking. Get 25% off. We enjoy them. You will too.
Yeah, and another good example is, so if you go back, so Samuelson is the key post-World War textbook. Mm-hmm. There's a prior textbook by a guy named Alfred Marshall, who's kind of seen as the father of like modern economics, right? Like Adam Smith is like the original guy.
Right.
Alfred Marshall is a British economist, probably the first one to actually be called an economist. No one would have called Adam Smith an economist back in the day. So Marshall writes probably the first economics textbook, comes out in like 1890. And he says essentially nothing positive about free trade. He actually has a whole section. The comparative advantage is this idea that, free trade, works out great for both sides. And it's attributed to a guy named David Ricardo, who was a great, early 1800s economist. Marshall has a whole section called The Narrowness of the Ricardians, where he specifically says, look, like Ricardo has this nice theory, has some good math associated with it, but it only works in very limited circumstances. It makes a lot of sense that Britain as a global empire is promoting it, but there are lots of people it doesn't work for. The Americans don't believe it. The Germans don't believe it. And he even has this hilarious footnote where he says a lot of these ideas basically seem to be used as a way for like people to put one over on the working class. And so like, again, all of this, and then if you even go back to Ricardo, like, and Adam Smith, these guys, as I was saying, Adam Smith knew the invisible hand didn't work automatically. Ricardo, when he's talking about free trade, he gives the example of how it could work. The famous example is England specializes in cloth,
right.
Portugal specializes in wine, and here's all the great ways it works for them to trade. Right there on the same page, he says, by the way, this only works if capital is immobile. Meaning, if the British cloth makers can't pick up and go make the cloth in Portugal, it's right there. And then even more, he notes, and he hopes that never changes. That the idea that basically people were going to be stuck investing and doing business in their own countries was one of the core premises of any of this working. So it's all there, and it's only post-World War II that you get, partly for the foreign policy reason, and then building on that, people looking around like Milton Friedman and like Friedrich Hayek and just saying like, wow, like this is all just working, right? Friedrich Hayek used this term, the self-regulating market. And he actually, it's funny that Hayek is one of these libertarians who's now associated with the right of center. And people say like, like conservative economics. Hayek has a very famous essay called Why I Am Not a Conservative, in which he specifically mocks conservatives for not being comfortable enough with the idea that markets are just self-regulating and will automatically deliver good answers. And so there's sort of this weird way where the ideas morph into, well, it's working, well, it must work automatically, all the way to this fundamentalism where, like you said, it's just like a law of physics. And if you don't understand that, you must be an idiot. And more importantly, you must be a heretic. And heretics are the one thing we cannot have.
Boy, I mean, well, that just, we watched that happen. We watched that happen. And I participated in the slander, by the way.
I did. I have my my original college economics paper. I've got like, here's my 2 pages on why free trade is good. And I have this great sentence that's like, while some workers will lose their jobs, they will find better ones. Like A. Correct answer. That's what you were supposed to say.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. We hope you'll subscribe to it. And by the way, you can hit the little bell on there and get notifications every time we produce a video. We hope you'll do that also.